because I was reading right before I got my first inoculation. I was reading how if you had already had it, you essentially would. The average person that had it recovered from it has the same amount of antibodies that you got from the first shot, and they were hanging out. So that's kind of comforting.
Yes.
Did they make any coffee, Em?
Oh, yeah.
Huh?
I went through, I went through the rudiments, but it doesn't smell like coffee. Well, lights on.
All right, guys, it's 10 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and start talking for the folks who are viewing at home. Whoever you are, thank you for being with us. We do have a few people up here today, so there's movement and discussion, and that's what I hope to get back to. So we're going to try to work on this. It'll be a transition, moving back up here with folks in the classroom while people are still viewing from home, so bear with us. Also, on that note, if you notice any, problems with viewing or audio or anything like that, or have any recommendations for how it can be better for you guys who are viewing from home, please, feel free to send me an email. I think Frank's going to put that on the screen, and just let us know, and we will work to try to improve this. So, we've got the means, we just don't really know what all to expect at this point. So anyway, glad you're with us, and I'm very glad to have a few people in here with me today. And someone important is missing, and that is Rick Butterini. Of course, I think he might be on vacation, but I'm going to give him a hard time anyway. He would normally be the guy that makes the coffee for us. Dave brings the bread, Rick makes the coffee, and Rick would typically come up here and entertain us while reading the announcements, which I'm going to do today. But Rick, you're expected to be on point after today. So anyway, announcements. We have church will be closed tomorrow, July the 5th, in observance of today, which is Independence Day. Happy Independence Day. Hope you guys have a good celebration with some good food, maybe some fireworks, and just, most important of all, just be safe. We have a youth retreat and lock-in coming up starting tomorrow through the 8th. That's July 5th through the 8th. For any questions about that, you just need to contact Sean. There's a trustee meeting, and I don't remember the original date of the trustee meeting for July, but it has been rescheduled to Tuesday the 6th at 7 p.m. Down in room 105. And, it was originally scheduled for July 13, but because of Vacation Bible School, we've pushed it forward a week. So there's also a fellowship table coming up for July, getting back to normal on July 9th. That's from noon to 1 p.m. down in the fellowship hall. So, anyone in the community is invited, bring guests. It's $5 a ticket for each person, which ideally is purchased in advance. And this will feature, the entree for the fellowship table this month will be Parmesan chicken with all the fixings. And it says come as early as 11:30. I think the eating actually commences at noon, but get there early, and fellowship and that sort of thing, and enjoy that. It sounds like it's going to be delicious. If you have any questions regarding that, as always, contact Jan Stoutland. There's also going to be, and I think this may be the first one since we've been getting back together, a service at Canterfield, which is on Sunday, July 11th at 6 p.m. I'm going to resume that monthly singing and worship service that they do over there at Canterfield. Vacation Bible School is July 12th through the 15th. It runs from 6 to 8:30, and the cost is free. And there's this Rocky Railway theme that's going on this year, and they're going to go through the Book of Acts, as a kind of Bible study, and there'll be crafts and outdoor games and all kinds of other activities and fun to be had there. So. Again, that's July 12th through the 15th. And then on the 15th, there's going to be a special Family Day Carnival for everyone to enjoy. So registration's free, and you can sign up at the website firstbaptistvbs.org. Looks like July is also our month for the Ecumenical Storehouse volunteering, so we always need volunteers for that. You're not going to make anybody upset if you just show up to help, so The days of those operations are on Tuesday and Thursday. It's from 10 to noon, and that's basically when the folks are coming in to pick up the things that they need, whatever that might be. And they've changed some things since the old days. The clients no longer come in and shop around, and a lot of most of this had to do with COVID. But they're interviewed by phone, and so everything kind of gets prepared ahead of time, and you're just kind of helping with the logistics of preparing those orders to meet those needs of those folks who are going to show up on those days and pick up the items that the Ecumenical Storehouse provides at no cost to the people in need. There's also Saturday donation pickups, which is where we will show up and we actually go out in the truck or in personal vehicles, and we will pick up donations around from the area to bring into the storehouse in order to meet those needs of the folks who are coming in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So all that's going on in July. Our team is scheduled on the 17th, I think, for the Saturday pickups. But then we for the month of July, we would ideally First Baptist would be represented on the Tuesdays and Thursdays of each week from 10 to noon. And I think that's about it. Talked about the trustee meeting. There is also a church council meeting on Sunday, July 11th at 2 p.m. That'll also be down in room 105. And then on July 19th, there is a library meeting at 2 p.m., which I assume is in the library. Probably a safe assumption, you think? Okay. All right, so that's it for the announcements. Now it's time for Sunday school. I didn't want to be naive and expect everybody to show up, although now we have even more people, so I'm pleasantly surprised. But, my hope was to get back to the format where we would have a lesson and have some discussion, and I would plan for some discussion. And so right now I didn't specifically create any sort of, discussion-oriented questions or anything like that, but feel free to interrupt me and ask questions as much as you like. I love that, and it's one of the things I miss the most and benefit from. I think we all do. So, but I pretty much wrote up kind of a lecture style lesson like I have been doing, just because again, it was possible that I'd just be up here by myself, and so in that case, I needed to be prepared. But anyway, let's get going. So last week we wrapped up on this book that I have been going through for quite a while by Dan Kimball, How Not to Read the Bible. And Kimball's goal there was to he wanted to just unravel these strange and crazy sounding things and controversial things that people who read the Bible will encounter, and the things that stand out. And I think he did a really good job. I would recommend that book to anyone, any Christian or non-Christian, who struggles to make sense of the Bible sometime or wants to have some sort of guide to help them work through these things. And I do think Kimball's book, given the level that it was directed to, I think he did a really good job. I think he did kind of come up short on a couple of topics, but all in all, he did a really good job. And again, a valuable resource for anyone who wants to read the Bible responsibly. So that's that as far as a recap and what we've been doing. Today, we're going to talk about God's presence. And I was honest last Sunday when I said I really wasn't sure what we were going to do this week. I had not really figured it out yet, but as is typically the case, I've been reading a book, and that book kind of prompted me to what I would like to talk about next. And it was actually more than that. Last week, whenever I was giving that last lesson, I talked about how, there's that part in the book of Luke where Luke describes how Jesus, after the resurrection, he's interpreting to the disciples all the things about himself and all the scriptures. And I mentioned how great it would be to have that as a text, have that in writing. What did he teach them? What did he interpret? And so that kind of actually, I was thinking about that after Sunday school. Actually, it was, Monday or Tuesday of last week. And I was like, well, there are so many scholars that are out there and other, people who are just studying the Bible and putting that stuff out there for us to learn, who are doing this, who are trying to figure this out, what it was that, what it might have been that Jesus was talking about, and specifically, looking for Jesus in the scriptures and how we can pull him out of there. And when I say the scriptures, I'm talking about the Old Testament at this point. And so this is exactly what is taking place in one of the books the most recent book I began reading, which is by one of my all-time favorite New Testament authors, and his name is Richard Bauckham. He's a New Testament scholar. And his most recent book is titled Who is God? And it's key moments of biblical revelation. And the very first chapter is devoted to God's presence, the divine presence that we see with God and with man, starting, all the way with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then with Israel, and then all the way fast forward to how that culminates and is fulfilled through the person of Jesus. And so I wanted to use, that chapter basically is turned into our Sunday school lesson for today. So today we're going to be looking at, God's presence in the Old Testament. And Bauckham explores this topic from the perspective of Jacob's dream at Bethel, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and how that illustrates, the revelation of God's presence there in Bethel, how that revelation culminates in God's ultimate revelation in the person of Jesus and in the giving of the Holy Spirit. So we're going to start by reading the story of Jacob's dream at Bethel to get it fresh in our minds, and that's in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10. Verses 10 through 22. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give you 1/10. So, basically what we have here is God repeats those promises that he had made to Abraham and Isaac, personally here informing Jacob that those promises are also, to him and his descendants. But the centerpiece of this encounter is this revelation of God's presence with Jacob. Bauckham points out that God's revelation to Jacob in this moment anticipates, much that the rest of the Bible has to say about the presence of God with humans. The context of our passage, if we're not all, if we're thinking of it, is that Jacob has just arrived in this place, Bethel, which he gives it that name, on his journey that began with him fleeing from his family home, if you remember, because his brother Esau was planning to kill him. His mom said, Your brother's going to kill you. You need to get out of here. Go to my relative's place. And so Jacob was heading to who is at this time his uncle's home, which was something like 500 miles away as the crow flies. And so this is the first time that Jacob has truly ever been on his own, and everything has changed for him. And this includes his relationship with God, because, up until this point, God was just, Yahweh, this was Jacob's family God, the God of his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. So Jacob is now on this path of, self-discovery. He's alone. He's figuring out things that, he never really had to think about before when he was at home and in that environment. And so part of this process is that he must also now figure out, he has to find God. He has to find God on his own, and find him as his own God rather than just, the God of my father and grandfather. And it's not as though Jacob really is sitting there contemplating, thinking of this stuff himself, right? It's actually God who comes to Jacob, just as he did with Abraham and Isaac before him. And so now let's a little bit of background info to Jacob's dream. Most translations describe, you think of Jacob's ladder, right? Most translations use that word. They describe Jacob as seeing this ladder in his dream. But more likely, this would actually be a staircase. And that Hebrew word just as well means staircase as it does ladder. The people of ancient Mesopotamia would often build these artificial mountains called ziggurats. And there was a famous ziggurat in the city of Ur, which is where Abraham, where Jacob's ancestors came from. And I've mentioned in previous Sunday school lessons how the gods were believed by those ancient folks to live on top of these mountains, like these cosmic mountaintops where earth and the heavens kind of collided or blended together, and that's where the gods would live. And so in order to worship the gods, the ancient peoples would often build these artificial mountains, and then on top of them they would build temples. And this way they could, the gods could dwell in the temple, and then the people could, make a journey up to the top of the mountain and worship the gods and be in the presence of the gods and that sort of thing.
No, I'm clearing my throat, but I did have a comment.
Sure.
I was reading that a lot of the ancient people in this area believed that their gods were residing in their land.
Mm-hmm.
And if they left their land, they also left their God.
Yes.
So this was a continuation of that.
Yes.
And Jacob is leaving his land. So the general population might perceive that as he was leaving God, but God was there.
It's possible. Yeah, we're not told that for sure, but that ancient mindset of that my God is kind of static locally to this place, to this mountain or to this area, that was absolutely a proper mindset. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit more, but that's good that you pointed that out, and that is correct. With this understanding of how the gods were always up above, on a mountaintop, and while the people dwelled below and in a certain place, with this understanding of the ancient world, we can kind of notice some remarkable things about God in our passage. For one, it specifically says that God stood beside Jacob in verse 13 of what we read in there in chapter 28. In other words, what you can take from that is that Jacob didn't have to make this trip up the mountain. He didn't have to go up the staircase, nor is his communication with God dependent on those angels that he saw coming and going. It's not like they were bringing him these messages and then taking his back up. God himself is described as coming down and standing next to Jacob in the place where he was sleeping on the earth. And this is just one of the numerous features about God that prove him to be very much unlike the way that they understood deity back in that time. God is not remote. He is down on earth with Jacob. And this was probably actually it is, you can tell by Jacob's language, this is one of the reasons he was so astonished by his dream when he woke up. As soon as he wakes up with the encounter, still fresh in his mind, he says, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. I mean, he just thought that right where he was, because of this experience, this is where someone goes to encounter God. And who would have known? To him, it was just an accident.
He didn't get the message, though, that God's everywhere.
Right. I think he does. I think Jacob, if you can't hear Gary, he said Jacob didn't get the message that God is everywhere. And I think what we'll see is that he does, but he's trying to process that. He's trying to simultaneously understand God to be in this location, but at the same time, he clearly understands that God has told him that he's going to go with him. So, I'm sure this wasn't just easy for him to figure out right away. But he eventually, he does process it. He understands and he experiences it. But, he's fully aware of the significance of God appearing to him, not just in heaven but down here on earth where he is sleeping. And, that's why he said, surely the Lord is in this place. And I did not know it. But as you can probably notice, even this recognition of God's, special presence at Bethel does not fully capture the deepest meaning of Jacob's dream. Bethel, which Jacob, gives the name of that place, by the way, means house of God. But again, his experience right there in the moment at that place isn't, the full revelation of what God is revealing to Jacob there. The deepest meaning is found where God tells Jacob, know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. So Jacob's instinct again was to recognize that this particular place was special. There was something divine and special about this place, since that's where he encounters God. And that's why he sets up the pillar. He takes the stone that he was laying on and basically makes it a pillar, anoints it with oil, and names the place where he's at Bethel, meaning house of God. But he also realizes that God is someone who will be with him wherever he goes. From now on, every place where Jacob goes and sleeps is Bethel. Bethel will be where he is. The house of God will be wherever he goes. And so in God's presence with Jacob is a recurring theme from here on out, as far as Jacob's life is concerned, but even after that. When Jacob finally does return to the land, after 14 years of being at the household of his uncle Laban, working as a shepherd, he remembers this first encounter with God, and reflects that the Bible says that Jacob says, the God who answered me in the day of my distress has been with me wherever I have gone. That's just we're told that Jacob reflects on that when he comes back to the land much later. And then again, when he's even older, we know the story. Jacob has to make this long journey to Egypt to be reunited with his sons. And then even then, God assures Jacob through visions that he is with him. And God even adds, I myself will go down with you to Egypt. That's in Genesis chapter 46. And then finally, at the very end of Jacob's life, shortly before he dies, he reflects back and tells his son Joseph that God has been my shepherd all my life. Having worked many years, for Laban as a shepherd, shepherding his flocks, he knew full well what it meant to be a shepherd. And that's where this kind of God as a shepherd thing really starts to be explored and thought about. And we learn a lot about God's presence from Jacob's use of this term, calling God his shepherd. This is someone who ensures the welfare and the safety of his flock at all times. And, the concept of God as a shepherd is illustrated probably, I think the best probably in the Psalm that most of us are familiar with, Psalm 23, the heart of which is captured in the words, for thou art with me. The Lord is my shepherd, for thou art with me. And so the idea of God being with us is a very powerful thing. And this is undoubtedly why Israelites would typically greet one another with the words, the Lord be with you. That's kind of how they would say hello and goodbye. And these words are in the Bible in many different places, in Ruth and Exodus, Judges and Samuel, and so on. And it was one thing that I think I had learned this before. I think I knew this, but I had just forgotten. And Balcom, brings it up in this chapter in the book. He reminded me, I think, that the word goodbye in English is actually, has its origins in the phrase "God be with you." There was an older English word that I couldn't probably try to pronounce, but it was similar to goodbye. It was like good, BWYI or whatever. And anyway, it was this shortened version, and it originally came from "God be with you" and turned into the word that we use, goodbye. That sounded familiar to me, but at the same time, it was kind of new to me when I read the book. So if I did know it at one point, I had forgotten it, but I thought that was pretty cool. But the point is that God's presence, with people is, it's a special thing. And it turned into a greeting for the Israelites. And God's presence is never to be understood, as neutral or inactive or some sort of presence that doesn't really make any sense. It can manifest itself in different ways, as the Bible shows us, but it always refers to God's, favor and care for those he chooses to be with. So we're probably all familiar with the attribute of God of omnipresence, right? You've got omniscience as being all-knowing, omnipresence as being all-present, omnipotent, all-powerful, and that sort of thing. But it's important to understand that from a biblical perspective, God is not merely everywhere, in a static way. He's not just permeating everything and he's just kind of there. His presence is personal and active. He wills and acts to be present, to every creature all the time at every moment. And that's something to keep in mind.
It's a very good point. It's something we all need to remember.
It is, because I started to think, when I was drafting up this lesson, I was thinking of questions maybe to ask, but again, I didn't want to get bogged down into that in case there wasn't really anybody here, and I can't, hear your all's answers on that. I can throw some rhetorical questions out there, but think about what do you think about God's presence? Do you always think about it? I'm always aware that God is everywhere, and that God is in some way with me and around me, I guess. But I'm not always fully thinking about how particularly present God is with me in every moment. I think the more that we can think that way, the better off we will be because of it. That God wills to be present at every moment with us in our lives. And that manifests itself, in different ways. But God is particularly present with us. And we see this, this particularity all throughout the Old Testament as God was with Jacob in his ongoing life. He's present with Israel, as the pillar of cloud. He's present in the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then in the temple in Jerusalem. He appears in, the special theophanies and dreams and visions, and the sheer silence even of in which he met with Elijah.
What's a theophany?
A theophany would be like it's a visual experience of God, where God appears to you like it would be different from like a vision or a dream. You're awake for a theophany, so it would be more like when the angels appeared to Abraham and the three showed up, and they gave him, you and Sarah will have a child and that sort of thing. They weren't having dreams or visions. Abraham even cooked for them and all that stuff, but but one of them, who is called the Lord, basically, that Abraham acknowledges as the Lord. There's a whole other lesson on that, but that would be like a theophany. God appears to you. He's not a person. It's not Jesus. Jesus wasn't just a theophany. He was a person, but kind of an in-between type thing. That's probably there's probably a much more concise definition of theophany, but I had to go off the top of my head there. So, but the point is that he's present with us in many different ways, but he's there all the time. And Balcom points out that many of these Old Testament appearances or presences of God, and even in like wrath and judgment, but also the theophanies and the pillar of cloud and how he would come to be in the tabernacle or in the temple, all of that. Many of these have equivalents in the New Testament, but many of them also find their culmination, their fulfillment in the divine presence that surpasses all of those others, which is in the incarnation, which God's presence as the human Jesus Christ. And so from then on, this enduring form of God's presence with his people is, from Jesus, and then it's as the Holy Spirit. And, so God's accompanying presence with his people is always part of God's revelation. And it's all, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, it just, gets better, for lack of a better description. Balcom points out how there's parallels between the revelation of God to Jacob at Bethel, and then next I guess would be the two places where God resided with his people Israel, the tabernacle and the temple. So remember that Jacob named that place House of God. That's what Bethel means. It was called Luz. Jacob gave it the name House of God, and that's how it's remembered in the Bible, because he believed God to be uniquely present there. In that particular place where he had this dream, but it was also revealed to him at the same time that God would be with him wherever he went from then on out. And so the tabernacle, being mobile, it moved with the people, corresponds to the ongoing, accompanying presence of God with Jacob wherever he went. And then the temple, being a static building in a certain location, it corresponds to the more permanent residence of God in his house, at Bethel, the house of God. And so you have both of those things at the same time with Jacob, and then you have the tabernacle, chronologically comes first, and then it becomes the temple. But the temple was created and built because that was the point where this wandering people decided this is the place where we're going to settle down. So really the tabernacle just kind of naturally evolved to a more static structure because the people weren't wandering around anymore. They were just in one location. But both, this accompanying presence and this static presence of God in this particular place where his people are, they both work together simultaneously. But even the temple, was never understood to be a place where God's presence was confined or anything like that. That was just where he was with his people. It simply stood as this tangible sign of God's accessibility to the people on earth. The temple wasn't just a place, for people to come visit, but also a place from which they prayed when they couldn't come visit. So even when the people were distant from the temple, they would turn to it and pray toward it at certain times of day. And so it ultimately just serves as this mediating figure between God and his people so that anyone could meet, with God. And that probably sounds familiar when you get to the New Testament. The temple just essentially assured all the people that God was down here with us and accessible to us as creatures of the earth. Now, it was certainly desirable to visit the temple. People would make the journeys and that sort of thing to the temple where you might seek out a special nearness with God in that place. But the presence of God in the temple could also be experienced and give strength to God's people, even from a distance, as we noted. The point is that God is with his people. And then so fast forward to the New Testament, and Jesus' closing words as told by Matthew in Matthew's Gospel. Jesus says, "And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." So this child who Matthew starts out by citing Isaiah and calling him Emmanuel, which is God with us. He's now this child is now telling his followers that he will be with them, always, forever, wherever they go. And so in this, God's presence is equated with Jesus' own presence. He speaks as God and also gives the assurance of the divine presence with God's people, just like God had done throughout the story of Israel with Jacob and others. And so I'm going to read a quote from Bauckham here because he just said it good, and I want to cite my sources. But Bauckham says, "The promise of an accompanying presence of God that would never fail, first given to Jacob, is now renewed and extended by implication to the nations that become Jacob's offspring through faith in the Messiah. This happens through a form of the divine presence that Jacob could never have anticipated, the presence of God in the midst of all human life as the human Jesus, Jacob's own descendant, who thus brings blessings to the nations. Jesus himself is God with us." And so he just kind of explains there how from Jacob and from those promises that were given to Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob about his descendants and the blessing and all that, all just comes to perfect fulfillment and even more in the person of Jesus. And there's another connection between Jesus and Jacob's experience at Bethel, found in John's Gospel. Jesus is talking to this man, Nathanael, and Jesus says to him, "Very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon not a staircase, but the Son of Man." So this is an explicit allusion to our passage from Jacob's dream at Bethel in verse 12, where Jacob sees the angels of God ascending and descending the staircase. And the scholarly consensus here is that the disciples that Jesus is speaking to, they constitute a kind of second Jacob. Bless you. And this, so the disciples are like a second Jacob, and they're now hearing or seeing the angels ascending and descending on a staircase. The staircase now corresponds to Jesus. Jesus is the staircase, and these divine beings, these angels, are ascending and descending to heaven, between heaven and earth, through him, on him, by him. In other words, Jesus himself is to be the way across that gap that bridges, that gap between heaven and earth. And John's Gospel also notes that Jesus says that no one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And just as we pointed out with Jacob's dream, the significance of the staircase was, not that Jacob or the disciples must ascend the staircase. Rather, God has descended now in the person of Jesus to be with Jacob, or in the person of Jesus to be with the disciples on earth. The only man to have ascended to heaven is the one who is with the disciples, and the only way for the disciples to ultimately ascend to heaven themselves is by way of this person, this man they follow, Jesus. So Balcom also illustrates how John's gospel portrays Jesus as the new tabernacle and the new temple. Balcom looks at the verse from John chapter 1, verse 14, which says, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." And you guys, I think the King James and some other translations actually say, "And the Word became flesh and dwelled among us." The word is the exact same, lived, dwelled. Balcom points out how the background for that word lived or dwelled resembles the Hebrew word from the Old Testament, which is used to describe the tabernacle as a place of God's dwelling. So it's understood that John's phrase here about how, dwelled among us, echoes these texts where God says, "I, the Lord, dwell among you," such as in Numbers chapter 35, which is referring to the tabernacle in the wilderness. So the implication of this, what he's getting at is that the incarnation of the Word, the Word became flesh, as John puts it, is something analogous to the way God dwelled with his people in the wilderness. But it surpasses that presence. It's better. John's language emphasizes a combination of something old and then something new and better. And so, and you can see this in John's language, that unique expression, the Word became flesh, is followed by a familiar expression from the Old Testament, which is, about God dwelled among us. So in other words, something greater has come to fulfill God's promises of old. And Balcom states that in Jesus, God's human presence becomes visible as it was not to Moses. In this unique and novel form of God's presence with us, the hope of the prophets that God will in the future dwell in a new temple in the midst of his people is fulfilled. Jesus himself is God among us, the new tabernacle or temple that fulfills and surpasses those of the Mosaic covenant. I didn't tell you that I was going to read a quote, but that's what I was doing there. Balcom, he concludes this section on God's presence by pointing out how the theme of God's presence with his people and being with his people goes, all the way to the end of the Bible, where the book of Revelation describes a time when God will bring to fulfillment, and perfection, this whole history of the world, where the relationship of humans with God will forever, the relationship of humans and God will be forever described as, and this is from the book of Revelation, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more." And so if you remember from when we went through Revelation and we talked about how death is destroyed and all of that sort of thing. So this passage in Revelation is bringing together, actually a few different Old Testament passages from Ezekiel and Zechariah and Isaiah. The part about wiping every tear away from the eyes particularly comes from Isaiah. And so Revelation takes these Old Testament passages and then kind of formulates them with this New Testament understanding of what God has accomplished in Jesus, in which all of Revelation is basically showing us from beginning to end. And so that Old Testament hope in God's presence is, renewed and also deepened and expanded upon and brought to fulfillment in the person of Jesus, who constantly made clear throughout his ministry that he was working to fulfill, that ancient hope of God being with his people and the people being reconciled to God and everything that comes with that. So that was pretty much the extent of my notes. So for y'all who are watching, I'm done talking. For anybody here, if you have any topics or concerns.
Didn't
questions.
Moses see the face of God?
He did. It says that he talks. It says that God talked to Moses like face to face. But when it describes Moses' experience of God, that's when Moses had to go.
Well, when he asked God to reveal himself to the rest of the Israelites, they panicked because they were afraid of it. So they obviously saw something.
Yeah, I think from their vantage point and what was happening on the mountain when Moses had gone up there, I think they were pretty afraid. I think the
Oh,
Bible
yeah.
makes that clear that they were frightened. And then I don't know. I guess their idea of experiencing God was not was one of just being afraid. And I think I could guess I can understand that. I would be too, given all their preconceived notions of deity mixed with this very real thing that was happening in their midst and what was going on with Moses. And then they had seen the results of God's wrath, against certain folks and the judgment that had come about. It's what is the quote? It's a dangerous thing to be, in the hands of an. I can't even remember what it is now, so I'm not going to butcher it. But they understood the danger of being in the presence of God, essentially, where sin is not tolerated and that sort of thing. But yes, but to what Balcom is trying to point out here is that given all these these illustrations of God's presence and how real He was at certain times with certain figures and times in the Old Testament, that's all been fulfilled and have something even better in the person of Jesus and then the filling of the Holy Spirit that we have as Jesus' disciples. So, any other questions, remarks? All right, that concludes our lesson. Thank you guys so much for being here in person, and thank you guys for being here virtually. I very much appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed Sunday school. We're going to keep this going. Don't forget, if you've experienced any technical difficulties from home, please let me know. Send me an email, and we'll try to get it working as seamlessly as we can. But I hope to see as many of you as possible who are not here actually here in person at some point. It's nice to be getting back together and back to normal to some degree. But I also want to accommodate for the folks who need to be at home or plan to stay at home for whatever reason. So anyway, thanks. Enjoy the worship service.
Welcome back. We forgot that.